Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, RB Laws, and this is my co-host.
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the recent support on our Houston videos. Shout out to commenters Xander Cade and Justin Bradley for the feedback on the Houston short. Once again, the continued support is always loved around here. You can continue to support us by liking and subscribing and following us on Instagram and X at the OBT Podcast for updates.
Yes. And also just, as a update, we do have something special planned for next episode, as long as everything works out, right? Not going to spoil it or say what it is, but just be prepared for the upcoming episode when we get into that. So our next team is the Dallas Mavericks. So obviously, they were kind of the talk of the NBA a couple seasons ago, right? They upset the Phoenix Suns in that 7-game series, right? Went to the Western Conference Finals, lost to the Warriors at 5. And then going into that offseason, right, they lost Jalen Brunson,
Mm-hmm.
replaced him with Christian Wood and JaVale McGee, so didn't really improve. But, they were a lot worse, I think, that season than I think most people would have expected. They were kind of up and down because they had stretches where they were a playoff team.
Sure.
Um, and then, at the deadline, right, if you remember, Kyrie requests a trade from Brooklyn, right, and then gets traded to Dallas, right, and then, there were kind of a lot of mixed feelings about it. I think we both thought that Brooklyn made out better than Dallas, but I think
Yes.
we still thought that Dallas would be a better team
Sure.
than they ended up being. But they were not very good, right? They were below 500 with both Kyrie and Luca in the lineup, and you could see why, right? It was just an incomplete roster. Not really any rebounding or interior defense, no real wing options to speak of. Um, and they ended up, tanking at the end of the season, right? Intentionally missing the playoffs so they could keep, that number 10 pick, right? So that way they could trade it, or just have some more flexibility, right? So
Mm-hmm.
they finished 38 and 44 last year. So I mean, I think they were 11th in the Western Conference. And then, in the draft, right, they ended up making those deals, right, where they traded the 10th pick and Davis Bertans to move down in the draft a couple of spots. And then they chose Derek Lively with the draft pick they ended up trading for.
Mm-hmm.
And then I believe they also used that trade exception that they used from moving Davis Bertans to pick up Rashawn Holmes from the Kings and then also draft Olivier Maxence Prosper. So, when you look at some of the things that they did this offseason, I think this offseason, when you look at some of the players they signed and grabbed, I think it was definitely a better offseason than last year's offseason. You look at, what they did. They re-signed Kyrie, right, to that 3-year contract, right? So you're not in a huge hole with him.
Right.
I believe the last year's a player option. So, if it doesn't work out, after a year or two, he'll be able to be moved. Um, and you're not paying him the complete max. I mean, you're still paying him a lot of money, for sure. But I believe he's making 37 million as a base salary this season. Um, obviously he's still here. And then after that, right, they sent out Reggie Bullock, right, because they picked up Grant Williams in that sign and trade from the Celtics. So, Reggie Bullock was kind of the guy that was the starter, for a while in Dallas. But now that he's out, you have two options at that wing spot, right? Either Josh Green or Tim Hardaway Jr.
Right.
Tim Hardaway Jr. was the starter, I believe, before Reggie Bullock came to Dallas. Um, so I don't know. Like the thing is with Josh Green, right? He's a guy that I think in that starting five fits better, just because he's more of a, you know, versatile guy, right? Where he's, he's a better defender. He's a better athlete. He's
He's
got a little
young.
bit more size. Um,
He's
and I
22.
think that yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the type of stuff that you want around Luca and Kyrie. You want some more athletic guys that are going to get after it on defense. Because Luca and Kyrie aren't super athletic guys, and they're not really necessarily the best defensively. Um, so I think Josh Green is the guy that should be in that starting spot. But it wouldn't surprise me if Jason Kidd went with Tim Hardaway just because he's a vet, and
Sure.
he's been in a lot of these big playoff games for Dallas. So then after that, Grant Williams, right? Obviously, they sign him to that new 4-year, $52 million deal in that sign and trade from Boston, right? Where I believe they sent over 1 second, and I think they got back a second
Mm-hmm.
because they sent Reggie Bullock to San Antonio. So I think he's gonna start, right? Because you don't give a guy a contract like that and to just come off the bench. Um, and then after that, you look at the center rotation, right? It's, I guess, in a way, a little better than last year, but it's
It's
still
better.
not. They brought back Dwight Powell, right? So I'm gonna assume he's gonna be the starting center, right? He's been there basically his whole career. I think he was drafted by Boston, and then I think he was sent to Dallas in that Rondo deal.
Mm-hmm.
That brought Rondo to Dallas. So, but other than that, right, he's basically been a Mav for longer than anyone in this roster. And then after that, you have JaVale McGee, um, who they signed to that weird 3-year deal last offseason. Didn't really make a lot of sense at the time, just given his age. I mean, he came off a good year for the Suns, but 3-year deal for a guy, at this stage of his career just didn't make a lot of sense, right? And he
Sure.
didn't really mesh with them, didn't really play a whole lot, especially down the stretch. So, he's kind of a guy that's probably, either not going to play a whole lot or could just be a guy that could just be moved. And then Rashawn Holmes, right, he was a guy that used to be a starter for Sacramento, right? But then once they, upped their center rotation, right, they got Sabonis. He was kind of ousted, right? Which again is kind of interesting, right? Because Alex Len at a certain point, became the backup big for Sacramento, and he was on a minimum contract, and Rashawn Holmes, is still under, not a huge contract, right? But 12 million, for another year, I think. So I mean, at this point, I mean, like I said, I think, when you look at the overall additions, right, then you go back to the guards, Seth Curry. I think that's a solid pickup for Dallas, right? He was a guy that was there before and played really well, in Dallas. He's a guy that I think fits in with a lot of teams just because he's a really good shooter. And you can run a lot of things, with him or through him, right? Remember, before the Sixers got Harden, right, most of their offense, while Simmons was out, right, it was basically like Seth Curry and Embiid, two-man actions.
Pretty much.
And then, they signed Dante Exum as a backup point guard, right? That was a guy, who was drafted by Utah, way back, as a lottery pick, didn't really pan out, had a lot of injuries. But now maybe it'll be like a Ntilikina situation, right? Where you're just kind of taking a chance on a young guy and just see if he pans out.
Mm-hmm.
And then Jaden Hardy, right, is another guy who was a young guy from their roster last year, who you're thinking will probably get more minutes. Um, and then, with the other bigs, right, other power forwards, Maxi Kleba, who's a guy that's kind of been like a versatile two-way stretch big for them, right? He's a guy that, defensively can kind of move his feet and he can space the floor. So he's kind of a guy that's a pretty valuable part of the rotation. I think
Mm-hmm.
they missed him during the stretch he was out last year. And then they just recently, I think yesterday, or if you're watching it today, a couple days ago, they signed Derek Jones Jr., right? I don't know how much he'll play, if he even plays at all, but
Right.
either way, that's still, another athlete that you could put out there that can guard multiple positions. So, you know, when you look at the strengths of the roster, I mean, obviously you got pretty good scoring at that guard spot with Luca and Kyrie, right? They can both create, pretty much any type of shot they want. Which is always ideal to have, at that guard spot. You have a little bit more flexibility, with the jump shooting. I think there were times last year where, it was just kind of a little bit more up and down. But, Seth Curry, you brought in there, he's a better shooter than some of the guys they had in there last year. Um, Grant Williams is another big that can kind of, space the floor, that can shoot at a pretty respectable rate. Um, but then, you still look at some of the other issues with the roster. Like I said, the big man rotation, I guess, is better, but it's still not ideal. Just like I don't personally like the idea of Dwight Powell being the starting center. I just like somebody just a little bit better. But, again, for the regular season, I think that's okay. Um, and then the wings, I think, is still an issue just because it's really Josh Green and Tim Hardaway Jr.,
Mm-hmm.
right? And those guys I feel like are more so like, they're not like really true wings. They're just kind of like sort of mask, especially Tim Hardaway Jr., right? He's more like a 2-3. I think you could have Josh Green as a wing, but he's still more like a 2-3, you know, than like a 3-4, right? Because he's not really gonna like, get you as many like rebounds or interior
Right.
contact. But either way, you do have some more help at that 4 spot, which I think is good. Um, so like I said, I like what they did this offseason for the most part. I still don't necessarily feel like it puts them, back into that upper tier of the Western Conference. They should definitely be better than they were last year.
Mm-hmm.
As long as their main guys are healthy. But then you also kind of look at the trade, deadline. Also, I think this is another team where like there's potentially some flexibility there, just because they have some contracts they can move. But I see this team as a potentially really volatile team where it could just go in a couple of directions where it could work well and they could be a pretty good team. But then there's like another world where like, you have some of the similar issues to last year and you're not necessarily as bad, right? But it's
Mm-hmm.
very clear that you're not good enough.
Okay.
And when you have a guy like Luca on the roster, you can't just be a middling team. So, there's definitely a path for them to make some really big decisions at the deadline, maybe with some of the other guys on the roster, or maybe even Kyrie if it doesn't work out. But either way, I do like for the most part what they did this offseason. So, what do you think of what Dallas did?
Well, I kind of have to start going back a ways because me and this team, we have some horrible history. I picked them to go very far in the playoffs and they didn't even make it. So I'm not doing this out of spite, but in general, I kind of have to disagree with you on the fact that, you don't think, they're going to be too much better. I think they're going to be a lot better because I
Oh,
think, in terms of like what they've done with Kyrie, signing him to that deal is great, I think. And also giving him and Luca, a full season together, I think is going to be something special to watch. And I think they'll be leaps and bounds better than the 11th seed is where they actually finish. So, I'm thinking like, I think the worst that they can probably do is eighth and the best they can
okay,
do is around like maybe that 7 or 6 seed. I think they'll be fighting, a lot because the West is so strong, and it's like
right,
the additions that they made were good, but it's kind of similar to like what we've been talking about with a lot of these other teams is like those additions may not be enough to get them to the finals, and win. That's the problem. Like, going back to what you were talking about, I think the young guys, I think that's the biggest like bright spot for me on this roster for sure. Picking up Lively the second, great pickup. I very high on him. He's going to be, I think, a phenomenal rim protector, and that's probably why they even have JaVale McGee around, anyways, is to kind of like be a mentor to him and show him the ropes. And then also Olivier Maxence Prosper. Great pickup, I think. We were pretty high on him in the draft as well. It's kind of like a 6'8" forward. So that should be interesting to have around Luca and Kyrie. And it's like, I think in general, this roster is solid. Adding Grant Williams, I just think it's leaps and bounds better than what we saw last season for sure. Because at times it just looked like really Luca didn't have too much help. And then when they brought in Kyrie, you could see it wasn't meshing well. You could see the potential was there, but the defense was so horrible to the point where it's like, okay, what can we really do? And the limitations on this roster are so obvious and glaring. But I think they really patched a lot of the holes. They got deeper for sure, especially at a lot of the positions that they were lacking at. Um, but I think the center position, like you said, is probably the one that's the weakest because, we know what Dwight Powell is. We know he's kind of like a stretch, somewhat rim protector, I guess. And then JaVale McGee, he's old, but then you have Lively. So it's like I feel like a lot is resting on the shoulders at this center position. So they may go out and, I don't know, grab somebody for
right.
something at the deadline. I don't know, but I just don't know who's going to be available. But in general, I think they had a very good offseason to the point where it does restore a little bit of confidence that I definitely had with them last season before the trade deadline. But I don't know. It's just there's a lot riding on this team. And it all really stems from going back even further to when they lost Jalen Brunson.
Right.
Jalen Brunson was such a impactful piece on this roster. It took so much pressure off of Luca to the point where his playmaking was so undervalued by this team clearly. And Kyrie, it's like Kyrie can add a lot more scoring potential, but nowhere near the amount of playmaking and manipulation that Brunson had
Yeah.
with Dallas, especially like side by side with Luka. It was just the perfect fit, and they really fumbled the bag with that one.
Plus, you also kind of have to factor in the contract where it's like, the contract that they would have given him if they had re-signed him would not have been, anywhere near as big.
It's
And
just not
then you
ideal.
could, yeah, and then like if you wanted to, the pieces that you move for Kyrie, you could just move for something else, right? You could have used, some of those pieces maybe to make an upgrade,
Hmm.
at the wing spot or the center spot, right? Maybe you could have grabbed like a Miles Turner, before he signed the extension last
Right,
offseason, right? Or something like that, or some player in that tier, or a wing in that tier.
right,
Um, but they, because Dalen Brunson walked, and they, didn't really have any means to really replace him with anything, and then, they brought in Christian Wood with that trade where they didn't give up anything to get Christian Wood, but he just didn't really pan out for them, just
right.
because of his defense. And so, he's gone. So I think in a way, we're kind of in a similar we kind of feel, I think, a little similar with Dallas because I think,
Sure.
like I said, it's more. It's not that I don't think they're good. It's
Hmm.
more so that like they weren't a good team last year and they definitely got better. It's
Right,
just like it's kind of like what you said, where the issue is how good enough are they going to be? Like they
right.
could be a much better team, but still may not necessarily go that far. And that's kind of like more so what I'm leaning towards. It's
I
not
get you.
like, yeah, like I definitely think they'll be better.
Yeah,
It's just like, are they going to be able to win, 4 rounds? Or maybe 4 rounds is too much of an ask, but like, can they get back to the conference finals? I think
sure.
that's going to be a really tall ask.
Yeah,
With the roster as currently constructed, but they do have some flexibility with the salaries on the roster. So there is a path to get somebody that could help, right? Like it wouldn't shock me if they traded like a couple of the young guys and an expiring contract or something
right.
for somebody. Because, like I said, with the volatility of the roster, you got to also factor in, those guys kind of got embarrassed last year just because, like, just how Dallas's season went. And I think there's, a pathway, for say Luca, right, to kind of, I don't know if revenge tour is sort of the right word, but just kind of like,
Take a leap.
like,
Another one.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Because I think his stock kind of took a little bit of a hit last year
It did.
just because the team wasn't good. And some people may not have liked the fact that, it felt like at times he was kind of like, quitting on the team in some senses, right?
They
Especially
labeled him as a diva.
yeah, especially defensively. So I think that there's a pathway, for that to be a factor as well. And he's still young, so he could get even
Right.
better. Especially if he, comes into the season like in, really good shape. He's been playing, I think, in the World Cup, although I think he got hurt. If
Yeah,
I'm
I think you're
not
right.
mistaken. But, still we'll see what comes out of that. But yeah, like I said, I do think that their offseason was solid. It's just, again, like it was so bad last year, just like, anything that would have been like okay, I think, would have made it better. It's just like
Sure.
it didn't have to come to this just because again, if you had kept Brunson and then used those pieces to get somebody else, then you would have been, they could have been right there with these some of these other teams at the top. Or
Yeah.
maybe not right there, but they'd be in the mix, right?
Yeah,
You'd feel
they
better about them, if they had the roster before. But, what's done is done.
yeah.
So
And it's
that's
like
kinda how you
I
have to
feel like a lot
look.
of people expected them to have somewhat of like what the Lakers had, a really good post deadline like record and showing, and that just didn't happen. And I think
Right.
that's just due to the fact that they brought in Kyrie, and it's like Kyrie's a great player, but I don't think he's at that point where we can label him as a difference maker, if that makes sense. Like,
Yeah,
and I know that's kind of crazy to say, but like it's just hard for him to gel, and especially
I
when he's
yeah,
not the biggest personality in the room. And we don't want to get too far into players' personalities and characters because we don't know these people. But you could just see and you could just feel
sure.
that there was something off in the chemistry, coaching, defensive schemes. They just self imploded last season, and it all stems from the Brunson fumble.
Yeah,
So I don't
exactly.
know. And like another trend that I've noticed of the teams that we're talking about, we're expecting a lot of these young guys to take big leaps, and I think that's
Right.
something that we're factoring too. It's like, what is this team going to look like if say Luca takes another leap? Will he be
Ex
able to convert into more of a floor general where he makes everybody around him better and it's not just, me, me, me. That's what I'm looking forward to. Um
right.
and will Kyrie be able to have a sustainable level of production throughout the entire season and also not miss any time due to some extracurriculars or antics or anything like that. But in general, I think this is a solid squad. I have a lot of faith in them, and I think they'll be better than a lot of teams that finished a little higher than them this last season. So
Yeah, because we kinda talked about it, we were talking about, when we were at the Houston episode and the Spurs episode, we were kinda getting into, like, is this team better than X team,
right.
or whatever. Like, I think there definitely is a world because again, we saw them in the Western Conference Finals a couple seasons ago. Now, the Western Conference wasn't as good,
Hmm.
but, there is a world where if everything pans out now, that's a lot of ifs, but, there is a world where they're a much better team. And like you said, there's a world where where they're able to avoid the play in. It's going to be tough, but they do have a top 5 player. And they do have a guy, in Kyrie who, any given night can look like, a top whatever player you want to
Yes.
put him in. Um, Again, like you said, it's just some of it also just stems from like right, like what does Josh Green look like, next season, right? Does he, kind of become a little more than what he is right now? Because
Hmm.
that's the other factor, right? There's a world where yeah, he does get better, but then like what if like, it's a little too much of an ask and maybe he's like a little better, right? But maybe not enough necessarily where it makes much of a difference. So,
Right.
there's two sides of the coin there,
And it's like
but
one more thing to add. We've said this multiple times, and I think we say it every time we talk about Dallas. Oddly enough, we say there is no excuse for Dallas to not be contending as long as Luka's on that roster.
Yeah.
Because we know what he's capable of, and we know, you know, he's a top 5 player when he's on fire. I think, and like I don't know, it's just, and we've talked about it multiple times. We think this is borderline mismanagement, or we're heading towards that. But in general, I think I'm not gonna say Luka's gonna have like an MVP season. I don't want to make this entire thing about Luka, but with these additions, I think he'll definitely play better because this is the kind of roster that you want to have around him. Big, like you said, big guys that are athletic, and then also a couple of people that can stretch the floor for sure. But you definitely
Yeah.
want more scrappy players that are willing defenders to get into the mix when Kyrie and Luka have shown us that that's not their game.
Yeah, and that's kind of the other like I said, the volatility of the roster is something to kind of, like I said, just pay attention to because
Hmm.
again, like I said, there is a world where maybe it doesn't work and maybe they're not necessarily bad, but they're maybe not necessarily where you would like them to be. And then maybe they're like, all right, let's kind of jump ship with this Kyrie situation. Um and I'm not saying that's gonna happen. I'm
It's
just saying like we
possible
have
though.
to factor in it's definitely possible. And then, again, they're one of those teams where we kind of talked about going into this offseason where they're on the clock. Cause like you said, and like I've said multiple times, you gotta be contending when you have a player as good as Luca on the roster.
Right.
And, if they, have another, bad season, right, then that puts you closer and closer to that timeline where Luca starts to, get really frustrated and potentially ask for a trade.
Right.
So, I think everybody in that organization is under a lot of pressure going into this season.
Yeah.
Um, it's tough because again, I don't think that they're going to be, one of the last teams standing, but I do think that they're definitely going to be, like you said, better. Um, but again, like sometimes that's all it takes, right? Because again, nobody expected them to make the conference finals a couple seasons ago,
Hmm.
so you just never know, right? Like there's also a world where they keep these guys, and then a couple of the other guys on the roster just have some incredible playoff stretches, right? And then all of a sudden they're back in the Western Conference Finals, and
Exactly.
nobody expects it. So that's kind of the interesting thing where it's like this team has an interesting ceiling. Like I said, I don't think it's quite a championship ceiling, but it
No.
also has a floor where like if everything goes wrong, like it could be really bad. Like I
Okay.
said, maybe not as bad as last year necessarily, but like I said, a level where I think there's going to be a lot of uncomfortableness
I could
going on
see them.
that roster.
I could see them maybe like underperforming in the season, and then that's kind of like an effect of what you were talking about, and then that puts them in the play-in spot, and then they have a play-in exit. I could see that. I think that's the worst case for them. I don't
Yeah.
think it's to the point where we're not going to see them in the play-in.
Right.
Like that. That's kind of the way that I'm looking at it. And like
I
back to
agree.
the mismanagement thing. Like if we look at the teams that finished below Dallas, right? So it would have
Right.
been what, Utah, Portland,
Yep.
Houston, and
Yep.
San Antonio. The
Yeah.
only squad on there that probably has a player that's even like remotely close to what Luca is right now is
Right.
honestly Portland. And we've been seeing them deal with this multiple times. We've been seeing Portland miss the playoffs and Lillard be out of contention for a long time. It's just a known fact that that's something that goes on in Portland, but that's unacceptable for Dallas because at the end of the day, we know that like a team with Luca should not be down there. Simple as
Right.
that.
Because that's the thing, when you look at the Western Conference, right? You look at the playoff seeding from last year, right? Denver, Memphis, Sacramento, Phoenix, Clippers, Golden State, Lakers, Minnesota, right? That's 1 through 8. Then you had 9 and 10 were New Orleans and Oklahoma City, right? So Dallas is going to have to be better than both of those teams.
Hmm.
And that's just to get to 9,
Yeah.
right? And then you got to be, better than one of those other teams at the bottom, Minnesota, Lakers or Golden State. I think the Lakers won't be 7, and I think, Minnesota, we'll see. But
Lakers will be a top 3 seed for sure.
yeah, I think the thing is that like, if that again, it's kind of like just regular math, right? It's just if one team rises up and goes in, then another team has to fall. So I
Right.
guess the question is, which team do you think Dallas is probably going to overtake? Well, I guess they'd have
Okay.
to overtake all 3
Yeah.
of those.
But what's the
So
most likely though? I would
yeah,
probably say New Orleans because
okay,
I think we all know, prayers and knock on wood, that this doesn't happen, but we all
right,
know one of those guys is getting hurt, and
yeah,
that's going to hurt them in the long run. So I think they can easily take out, you know, they can overtake New Orleans for sure. Now, OKC is a tough one because I don't even think, have we even talked about them yet?
we haven't talked about
Yeah,
them yet.
but we'll get to them in later. But
Yeah.
they're a tough one because they're gonna leap forward, and I think Shea's gonna have another amazing season, and we could see them potentially rise.
Yeah.
Um,
Minnesota.
Minnesota, that same thing, but it's Edwards this time, and that's what I'm talking about. Like we have to factor in all of these young guys who are on the come up, and they're the next generation of greats. They're going to be taking these leaps that are going to be astronomical, I think, every season.
Right.
So we do have to factor that in, and it's like Anthony Edwards could make a leap, um, and then with Towns, I don't think Towns is going to take a leap. I think he's pretty much at his pinnacle, but like I don't know if that Dallas team has what it takes to overtake them. I think they can, but
Right.
it's going to be hard, I think. But
Yeah.
and then like you said, the Lakers, I think they're going to be a top 3 seed, top
Yeah.
4.
And that's the
So,
tough part. 'Cause there
yeah,
could be one of those teams that finished higher that will finish lower.
right.
Because let's say
The
a
Kings are
team
going to
like
finish lower, I
yeah,
think.
yeah, like say like the Kings fall, or I don't know, a team like a Memphis falls, right?
Yes.
Not that those teams are going to miss the playoffs, but like maybe those teams aren't the 2 and 3 seed next season, and then that can kind of shake some things around. Because again, if Dallas is to make the playoffs, which I think we both feel like they will, as long as they're healthy,
Yes.
that means that at least one of those teams is going to have to come out because they didn't
Right.
make the playoffs last year, and so that's kind of why it's kind of interesting to discuss like which one of those is most likely to fall out because then
It's
that
probably
means
going to
there's
be Minnesota.
yeah, because again, as we've continued to say, there's going to be some disappointed teams this season because there's going to be teams that I think are good enough to make the playoffs, but because it's the Western Conference, they're not going to make the playoffs. And there's going to be, like I said, at least 2 or 3 teams that I think are going to feel really disappointed and let down
Absolutely.
how their season went. But I think, like I said, I think, like you said, Dallas did enough where they should be a team that should rise, just because, again, they have more talent than they had last year. And of those teams that we mentioned, they have the best player, right? Like
Yes.
if you look at Minnesota, Oklahoma City, and then what was the other one? New Orleans, right? Yeah, like
Yes.
Luka, he's the best player of those guys in that stretch.
Absolutely.
Um, it's just a matter of that supporting cast, right? Kyrie's a pretty good number 2 option. And then you should, in theory, have some other guys that should be able to help, like I said, more than the guys helped out last year. Because they had a few stretches where they had some guys like I think they had a stretch where Kemba Walker, was playing like major minutes on the
Yeah.
team, and now he's overseas.
Yeah,
So,
they waived him, I
so
think.
right, exactly. So, like you said, in theory, they should be a lot better than last year. It's just the seeding is going to be really important because, like you
Sure.
said, if they finish in the play-in, that's a tougher spot, to be in.
And that's their worst
Unless
case scenario, I think. I don't think
right,
we'll see them miss, the play-in. I'll
yeah,
say that.
I'd be pretty surprised if they missed the play-in. They should at least be in the play-in. I think. I think
Exactly.
they got assuming they're healthy, right? Because again,
Yeah.
that's always the other factor. But like you said, every team you have to factor in health. It's just some
Yes.
teams, like you said, like New Orleans, you have to factor in more than others.
Absolutely.
That's kind of the factor with Dallas. So I guess kind of like what we said before in terms of the ceiling. Like I said, I think they can win. Definitely win a playoff series.
Mhm.
Depending on their seeding, I think they could possibly win 2, but I think
Okay.
they would need to make a deal at the deadline, in order to go, in order to like for me to say like yeah they should get to the second round or further. But I think that they're definitely a playoff team. They should be a good team. Um, and even if they're not like one of the top teams, I do think it's a team where like in a 7 game series they could give somebody a scare just because again, in a 7 game series when you have to face Luca and Kyrie, and you do have some guys on the roster that can play some defense.
Right.
Uh, I think that's something that you have to factor in. Like I said, I think that they still need to make, a couple other moves, if they want to get to the ultimate goal of going a little further than the first round. But, like I said, this is definitely a good start, I think.
Yeah. For me, it's very similar, but I'm gonna go and take it a step further. I think they can get to the Western Conference Finals. Honestly, I'm not
As
gonna.
currently constructed.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
ideally that's probably their limit. I don't think they can get to the finals. I think they would be burnt out and gassed out. Because we already know something's gonna happen. Like something is always happening with a team, with Kyrie on it. But and that's not to attack him, but yeah, I just think Western Conference Finals is probably their limit. I think they're gonna have a tough regular season. That's for sure. I think it's gonna be a battle. They're gonna have to make every game count if they really want to be in the higher seed and really avoid the play in. I think that should be their number one goal is to avoid the play in at all
Yeah.
costs because I think like you said, the volatility of this roster is definitely could has potential to be exposed in a play-in game because I mean that's just what it is. It's not the normal playoffs that we're talking about. It's the play-in. So I don't know. I just think that they're volatile when it comes to the play-in. I think that's their weakness. But um, in general, I think they'll probably finish in the Western Conference Finals. But it wouldn't surprise me if they get bounced in the first or second round.
Yeah. Yeah, because that's the thing. Like I said, I just think that there's a lot of possibilities for this team,
Yeah.
where again, like, if it goes right, they could get, to the conference finals, probably not much further than that. But if it goes wrong, right, then, again, like you said, it could be an early play in or
Yeah.
first round exit. And again, we don't do gambling on the show.
Nope.
Some of the over and unders, for some of these betting places, they have Dallas at around 44.5. Which, if doing my math, it looks like they're like the seventh Western Conference, team there. So they basically kind of have them like right around that play-in
Right.
spot. Which,
Which
like
is
you said, I
something they
think
should
is
avoid.
yeah, yeah, exactly, yeah, because that's the problem. Because again, you still have to factor in up top, right? Nuggets, Suns, Lakers, Warriors, Clippers, Grizzlies. I don't think you can forget about them, right? And Kings as well, right? Like there's a lot of teams where I think like they're probably gonna have to find some ways to be better than. Um, but again, like again, when you like, let's say if you compare them to the Kings, right? Like I mean, again, Luca with solid players, that should be a team that should be able to get you at least, like 40 something wins,
Sure.
in my opinion. Maybe that's a tall ask. Um, but I think you should at least be 500.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree
Again,
100%.
yeah. So I guess, because like I said, there's a lot of potential trade possibilities, because we mentioned like, maybe a wing or a big, or maybe it's a Kyrie deal. But, like I said, we're kind of right now more so focusing on the team as currently constructed.
Hmm.
And we did analyze some of the strengths and weaknesses. So, on to the grade, I guess. So, what grade do you think you would give the Dallas Mavericks
Ugh,
for the offseason they had?
this is a tough one. Um, I'm probably gonna go. I don't want to be. I'll be harsh. I'm gonna give him a
Oh,
C.
okay.
Um, I know normally like I would probably go in that B range, but I have to be harsh just due to the fact that they do have Luca and Kyrie. Like I think re-signing Kyrie, great deal. The draft picks were very solid as well, lively, and Maxence Prosper, great pickups as well. Um, and then getting deeper, I think, is definitely something that they targeted for sure, especially at the guard spot, signing Dante Exum. And then obviously Grant Williams, I think that's an underrated pickup as well. I think his value is great. It's just we didn't get to necessarily see it fully in Boston, I don't think, and that's probably due to the lack
Fell
of
out of
coaching.
rotation.
Exactly, falling out of the rotation and lack of uh, player to coach trust, whatever the case may be. So I think it'll be better because at the end of the day, Dallas needed defense, and they got some guys that can defend multiple positions, and then also they got deeper, kept both their stars. So I can't really be too mad at it, but at the same time, I don't think it's enough to win the championship, but it will be enough to make them better. So I'll probably go around C plus.
Yeah. I think, usually I think I'm a little bit harsher than you.
Yes.
Normally on the grades, but I think this time I'll actually be a little bit more generous. Like I said, I'll give them a B, B
Okay.
minus. Kind of, for most of the same reasons that you gave. Just I'm just looking at it from the perspective of they were a bad team last year, and I think they got better.
Yeah.
With the moves they made, like you said, I think the Grant Williams pickup is an underrated pickup. Right, this was a guy that was on, a team that got to the NBA Finals and played big minutes for them. Right, it was him in Game 7 against the Bucks, right, where he had that crazy game, where he hit like 7 threes, had like
Yeah.
30 or whatever it was. Um, to blow out the Bucks and send them home. He had some, other really solid playoff games. Like you said, he seemed like he fell out of favor with Joe Mazzulla as the coach last year. And I think also just Boston, considering the amount of money they were getting ready to spend, on their roster, right? They gave Jalen Brown the big extension. They brought in Porzingis and gave him a big extension.
Mm-hmm.
It just felt like they weren't going to keep everybody. So like when you look at it from that perspective, like you said, they brought in, a couple of guys, like you said, like Grant Williams, he's a versatile defender. We're expecting, a bigger year for Josh Green, right? So that should help. Um, but then again, like, Maxi Kleba, if he's healthy, he should help out defensively. Derek Jones Jr., we'll see where that goes. That's kind of one of those minimum contract gamble signings where if they pan out, it'll be really solid, and if not, then whatever.
Right.
Um, but like I said, it's just I think there's a lot, of gray area for this team where, like I said, there's a world where, like you said, they finish, in that, top six, but probably closer to 5, 6. But then there's a world where, like you said, they're in that 7 to 10 range, where they're in the play-in and, they lose one game and then they're out of it.
Right.
Like let's say they're the 9 seed, and they lose and then, they miss the playoffs again. And that, like you said, that just shouldn't happen, with a team with Luca, on the team again with a decent supporting cast. This is a better supporting cast than last year's team. Post Kyrie trade,
For
right? Not,
sure.
yeah. I'm just talking about post Kyrie.
Yeah.
Um, so like you said, it was a decent offseason, like not a great offseason. I don't really feel like we've really given too many teams A's. I don't think I've given out a single A. I think you gave out one.
It was an early one though. Who was
think
it?
I think it was two. I think you gave out an A to the Suns and I think an A to the Lakers, if I'm not
I think
mistaken.
you're right. Yes,
Um,
I think
I
you're right.
haven't given out any A's, and I don't think this was an A off season. But like I said, I
No,
look at
no.
it at the start
Yeah.
where, there's a path, to become a better team. It's just like I said, some of it, like kind of like the Westbrook deal for LA and then the subsequent trade deadline, where like some of this is just you kind of brought it on yourself,
Right.
right? Because again, like you said with Dallas, they could have re-signed Jalen Brunson to a very friendly contract. Then you wouldn't even need Kyrie because it's
Right.
not even like you said Kyrie as much. It's just you gave up things to get him, and those were kind of valuable pieces, right? Like
Right.
Dorian Finney-Smith, right? If he was on this team and it was Jalen Brunson instead of Kyrie, and then you had like Brunson, Luca, Dorian Finney-Smith, Grant Williams,
Oh my gosh,
Dwight
imagine
Powell,
that.
yeah, like that's and then like Hardaway off the bench,
That's more
Green off the
ideal.
bench, Curry off the bench, like that. That's a really good team.
Yeah.
Um, but we're not living in fantasy land right
Nope.
now. That's kind of a what if, scenario. Um, but like I said, is this team solid? Yeah, I do think so. Because like
Hmm.
you said, they should be better. Like you said, it would be a shock to the system if they just missed the play in.
Right.
Like I said, I just feel like it would have to be like some type of catastrophic injury. Um, but it will be interesting, for Grant Williams, just because again, now he's going to be, I think, a full-time starter, where he kind
Yes.
of like, he played big minutes for Boston, starters minutes, but wasn't really a starter. But now he's gonna presumably be starting and closing games. And I'm curious to see how he's utilized in Dallas, just because again, he fell out of favor in that rotation. Um, but what does he look like? Because again, this is a very different system. Where again it's a team built around two, more guard oriented guys. I know Luca's, a big guy, right? But he's, essentially like
He's a
a
guard.
guard.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's a guard. And then Kyrie's obviously a guard, right? Whereas in Boston, you're surrounded by two wings, right? Tatum and Brown are wings, so it's a very different team. So I think his role, what they're going to ask of him will definitely be more than what he was doing in Boston, but I think he can handle it because again, he is a guy that, was a big part of a team that got to the finals. Even though they
Absolutely.
didn't win the championship, he's a guy that does have, experience on being on a winning team. So
Yeah.
I think he's a guy that can kind of come in and, help out a lot. I know he's a guy sometimes that can rub some people the wrong way. But, again, I think he will at times give Dallas, a little bit of an edge because it felt
Yes.
like they were really missing that, last year because
That's
they
what
didn't really
happens when
have.
you don't have any defenders.
Yeah, exactly. So, again, they added more size. They added some, some guys that can, add some versatility. But I think they do need to add more. But I do think it's a good start. So I'll give them a B.
Yeah.
B minus.
And like the way that I look at every move that they make from here on out is a move to get back on track. We know what their trajectory was. Like you
Right.
said, you already talked about it in the beginning, but we know where this team was headed and last season was such a step back due to the fact that the Brunson fumble. So it's like every move that I look at from here on out is a move to get back on track and I think this is the catalyst for that. So,
Yeah. But yeah, like I said, I'm still not pleased with the center rotation because I think you still got some concerns on the boards and the
yeah.
interior D. But I'm assuming that they will at least be in the mix, for some deadline deals. But
Yes.
we'll see because this draft, ended up there ended up not really being any draft day trades. So I wonder what the trade deadline will look like going into next February just because it was pretty it was a trade deadline last February that most of the deals were before the trade deadline, like because we covered it live. There were some deals deadline day, but
Right.
most of the action took place before.
Yeah, it was
So
like a couple of days before, you're right.
Yeah, exactly. Like the Kyrie deal, the Durant
Yep.
deal, the Westbrook thing, all that was before, that Thursday. So,
Yeah.
I do think that Dallas is a team to watch at the deadline because I think
They're looking to improve.
yeah, because yeah, exactly, because they're either going to be like, we're pretty solid, let's add to this core, and make a big run, or it's not working, we might have to bail on like Kyrie or something like that. So, like I said,
Exactly.
this is a team I think definitely to watch next season. Um, you know, in multiple ways because again obviously you got a superstar but you also have a lot of different pathways that this team can go, but I do think regardless I think they will be better.
Yes.
Yeah, so now now that we've kind of wrapped up our discussion about Dallas, now we're going to get into some more news and rumors. So obviously if you hadn't heard, right, Josh Hart, we talked about it on the previous podcast. Now he has signed that 4-year $81 million extension with the Knicks, right, keeping him in New York, or not completely but you know what I mean,
Yeah,
like
I know what you mean. Yeah.
yeah, he's locked up under contract for 4 more years in New York. And again, he was a guy that the Knicks grabbed at the deadline, and I think really helped turn their season around. Kind of, he's a guy that at that guard spot, is versatile enough to play, kind of like the two or the three. He's a terrific rebounder. He makes a lot of big hustle plays. He's not afraid. Um, kind of as they got deeper into the playoffs, right, he didn't, play quite as well. His shot seemed like it started to disappear. But regardless, I think if you're the Knicks, you love having Josh Hart on your team because again, he's a guy you don't really have to worry about, um, in terms of again the effort that he displays on both ends of the floor, right? Because they had a couple of iterations with the Knicks where they had that year where they made the playoffs, they just didn't have a lot of talent, so they went out in
Sure.
the first round, and then the following year, right, that talent kind of took a step back. But now, they should be better. And Josh Hart, he's on that Team USA, roster. And he wasn't playing, but that's because he was negotiating the extension. But
Mm-hmm.
now I think that they said now that he signed the extension, he'll be with the team and we'll see him, with the rest of the guys.
Yeah. You know, I've talked about him multiple times. I think Josh Hart is a very undervalued player. I've also been seeing a lot of people hate on him for even being on the USA roster, which is crazy and obscene. That just shows how many casuals there are out there. But in general, like I think this is a great move. It just provides this team with some spunk and some go after it basketball where it's like it's a hustle guy. He's not afraid to get on the floor, whether it's be he gets injured or not. He's gonna value that hustle play just as equally as somebody would a game winner. So I think that mentality is something that's underrated. A lot of players don't have. So shout out to him for getting that contract.
I agree. Um, Moving on, according to Shams, the Hawks are pausing their pursuit of Pascal Siakam. Basically, they don't mind, going with the team that they have going into the season. So
Oh boy.
reportedly, they were, I guess kind of throwing out in terms of a deal, DeAndre Hunter, AJ Griffin, and draft picks for Siakam, and the Raptors said no.
Hmm.
Um, obviously Siakam's been in some trade rumors. And then it seems like part of what's holding it up is because, reportedly he's been telling teams he's not going to resign. And, who knows? Because, again, I think he can help out a team. I think he can help out the Hawks. It seems like that's the team that if he gets moved, he's kind of in a way destined to go to because it just seems like there's the most smoke there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, that type of deal, if Atlanta pulled that off, I actually do like that for
Me
Atlanta.
too.
Just because again, like you have other forwards on the roster, a ton of them. So I think DeAndre Hunter is a little bit more expendable than he might have been previously, and I just think Siakam that's an upgrade, as a guy who can
Absolutely.
be another star on the roster, right? And he's not going to be the best player on the team, um, which he's kind of been in Toronto, right? Because again, like as a number one guy, right, you're probably not a great team. You can be a decent team. But if he's your second or third guy, right, we saw, right, that was a team, that made deep playoff runs, when he was, a guy that didn't have to be the number one option.
Right. And it's like my thing is I think, Atlanta is one of those teams currently constructed where the recipe for success for them is to get a third star. So I think, they do need to pursue someone else. But my question is like, if Toronto's not willing to do that, that basically means they're not engaging in a full on rebuild. Like if they're not willing to give up Pascal Siakam for anything, then I mean that just tells me that they're not ready for the rebuild, and I think that's a mistake. I
Yeah.
know, previously we were like, don't blow it up, but now that Van Vliet's gone, I think you do need to move on from Spicy
Yeah.
P as well.
And you didn't get anything back for Van Vliet. So,
Exactly.
there's a world where, let's say Siakam's gone and then you don't get back anything for him, either.
You need to
And,
act now.
if you're Toronto, that all of a sudden puts you in a rough spot because you lost two of your best players, in free agency and you had an option to trade them. Now, again, maybe at the deadline there wasn't anything for Van Vliet, which is fair, right? But I would think, Siakam, I'm sure there are teams, a lot of teams lining up to offer stuff for Siakam, as we know with the
Absolutely.
Hawks. Um, and like I said, I don't think that's a bad deal if you're, Toronto, because again, you get, even though DeAndre Hunter's on a kind of big contract, right? He's still a decent young player, and then AJ Griffin, right? That's a decent young player, and then presumably you'd be getting picks from Atlanta. And again, Atlanta's in an interesting spot because they traded away multiple firsts, I believe, unprotected to get DeJounte Murray,
Mm-hmm.
right? So they're kind of a team where and then they just dumped John Collins for basically nothing.
Whew.
So they're kind of a team, that's
Can't wait to talk
looking.
about them.
Yeah, exactly. So they're kind of a team I think that in a way they kind of have to be a competitive roster and they kind of have to go all in on somebody,
Right.
because again, you're not going to have your pick. So if you're just mediocre, right? And what are you really doing? So
Exactly.
um, if they can pull that off, I like that for Atlanta. And I'd
Yes.
like it for Toronto as well because again, considering it's better than losing him for nothing.
Yes.
Um After that, right? Again, according to same thing, from Mark Stein, right? Lakers still interested in Christian Wood. Again, that situation hasn't changed. We know that there are teams that are interested in signing him. I think part of it is I think like we've mentioned with the Harden Lillard thing, I think some of these guys are just still holding out, and just waiting to see if something happens because that can kind of change,
Yeah.
some potential opportunities financially for some of these guys. So, when it happens, it'll happen and we'll talk about it. But for now, there's nothing really to say.
Yeah, and it's like with Christian Wood, it's sad to see because he does have a lot of offensive talent. I think majority of these teams could use him. It's just like where does he fit and how long is it going to take is the real question. And like you said, I think he's just waiting in the wings due to the fact that like we're just waiting on the big guys to get moved. But and that's kind of holding back his contract negotiations with whoever may be interested.
Yeah. Uh, Another Mark Stein rumor: Celtics may sign Blake Griffin. Boston has not ruled out a reunion with veteran forward. Again, I
Mm,
know he's a guy that kind of has been liked by his teammates, so I'm assuming that's kind of more of like a locker room,
absolutely.
signing because again, you still have, and again, we'll get into Boston later, right? But they, have a decent amount of bigs where he's probably still not going to play.
Right.
It's just the guy, just a veteran guy to add to the roster, that the team likes.
Yeah.
And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that because again, in terms of free agency, there's no one really left for them to sign that's like super impactful that probably wants to go there. So
Yeah.
because that's the thing you have to factor in with Boston as well, where they're not typically a team that gets, like these bargain free agents.
Right. And it's like I don't really have a problem with it. Keeping him around just in case also is pretty cool to have around, I guess. Like, say, knock on wood, Porzingis gets hurt or something like that, and then, the other
It's already,
bigs, well, yeah, but you know what I mean, like,
yeah,
deeper into the season, then, that leaves you room to put in Blake Griffin. Although, the production isn't what it used to be, obviously. Injuries, age, all a factor, but I think he's still a good player, and I think he still has some years left in the tank potentially.
yeah. According to the Athletic, Jaden McDaniels got taller. 22-year-old Wolves forward is allegedly measuring at 6'11" in summer workouts.
Jeez.
So I believe he was 6'9",
Yeah, that's pretty
last
cool.
season. So if he grew, to 6'11", that's kind of something, to look out for. Just, and it's again, we sometimes we hear rumors about guys growing in the offseason. Like I think what was it like last month? I think it was Phil Handy of the Lakers. It sounded like he was kind of posing the idea that Jared Vanderbilt grew a couple inches.
Right.
And I think a couple years ago, I think it was Brad Stevens who said like that Jason Tatum, had grown to like 6'10",
Yeah.
or something like that. And so it's like, you do hear that. And again, like these guys are, physical marvels, so that, because most people usually stop growing once they're, an
Yes.
adult. But these guys, we've seen, right? They'll still grow a few inches even, into their 20s. And there are people who do that, right? But these guys are already, you know,
Tall.
uh, yeah, they're already
Yeah.
tall and they're already, people that aren't, regular size. So
Exactly. And it's like
they're not regular human beings.
whenever I hear rumors like that, and even with weight too, I do want to address one thing that's kind of
Yeah,
interesting. Like whenever I hear a weight
comes
rumor,
muscle.
or yeah, muscle or a height rumor. I'm
Yeah.
it's not that I don't look at it as a good thing. Sometimes it can be a bad thing though. You know,
Right.
like if you look at like Russell Westbrook, ever since he put on like those pounds, it really affected his jump shot, and you could tell cuz like he used to be a decent like mid-range shooter and sometimes pretty good from the 3. But, you know, once he put on that muscle, it changes your shot. So it's kind of interesting to hear like maybe if some of these guys like, you know, potentially, you know, they're taller, you know, does their shooting get worse because then they have to adjust to being a little taller, or does it get better, you know? So that's kind of the way that I look at it. But sometimes I take him with a grain of salt because, you know, you look at them and then they still look the same. It's like
Yeah.
there's been no change in the game either.
Right.
So
Yeah, like Giannis, he put on more muscle, and then you like you said, his shot kind of got worse.
exactly.
You know, AD put on more, muscle, and
He got
he
slower.
lost. Yeah, he his shot kind of fell off, and he got a little bit less athletic.
Hmm.
So, like you said, it's a crapshoot in a way, and like you said,
Yeah.
sometimes it could just not be true because,
Right.
like you said, some of the guys just honestly look the same.
And
Um,
their game is the same too. So it's like,
yeah,
okay. I mean, it just sounds like people are just talking and talk
you know,
sometimes, but
yeah, because we remember like the famous Ben Simmons off-season workout videos, where
yeah,
he's pulling up from three and
right.
taking all these crazy shots, but then you don't actually see it in the game.
Exactly.
Uh,
Same thing with Cole Anthony. You don't see Cole Anthony running down the court and splashing threes in Donovan Mitchell's face, but you do whenever he's at a Chris Brickley workout.
yeah, so it's always kind of intriguing to discuss.
Yeah.
Um, Next up, according to Shams, Warriors to work out 6 players. So Juan Toscano Anderson, Dion Waiters, Kent Bazemore, Tony Snell, Harry Giles, Trey Burke. So these are guys that are going to visit the
I
facility.
also heard Michael Carter Williams was in the mix too.
Okay, so I guess Michael
Yeah.
Carter Williams as well.
I know that
Uh,
probably wasn't in the rumor, but I did see that. So,
yeah, so that doesn't mean any of these guys are going to get signed because
right,
we've
right,
heard
right.
this in the past. Where teams will work out players like I think the Suns a month ago they worked out like guys like Stanley Johnson,
Wow.
and a few other guys like that. And sometimes those things kind of come to fruition, but they don't always. If they were to sign any of those guys, is there a guy in particular of those players that you think makes sense for them? Juan Toscano Anderson was a guy who played for them.
Yes.
I think the year they were a play-in team, he didn't play as much the title year,
Yeah.
and then he was
Bazemore
on the,
too.
yeah, and yeah, I think Bazemore was on the play-in team. He wasn't on the
Yeah.
championship
No, no, no.
team.
I wasn't saying the same team, but I was just saying that he played for
Yeah,
the Warriors as well. But I would
right.
probably go with Bazemore or Anderson, honestly, just because there's already somewhat of a rapport. I don't think Snell fits. I don't think Dion Waiters fits. I think most of those guys are probably done, but it could just be me.
Giles.
Yeah, I just think it's probably down to Anderson and Bazemore for me.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I guess like it makes sense just because they were former Warriors,
Right.
um, and they were also former Lakers as well, which is kind of
Yes.
funny. But
Yeah, the
so
Bazemore Laker era was very interesting.
yeah, because
Good
well,
times.
actually, and it's unfortunate for him because he was on the Warriors, then he went to the Lakers because and took less money
Yep.
because he wanted to play for a contender, but also he was going to play more because he initially began that season as a starter,
Right.
and then they obviously missed the playoffs. He fell out of the rotation completely, and it was pretty quick, right? He went from starting to like not really playing at all. And then the Warriors went on to win the title that year,
Right.
right? And then Juan Toscano Anderson, right? He's on the Warriors the title year, so he gets a ring.
Right.
And he leaves to go to the Lakers, right? Plays kind of, and then doesn't he gets hurt and just kind of falls out of the rotation, and then he's
Right.
traded. So I don't know, and
It
now he's
happens.
not on the roster. So it wouldn't surprise me if those guys come back, but you always have to look at the 14th, 13th, 14th, 15th roster spots. Those are usually not game changers, right? Those are
Exactly.
guys that just kind of come in and fill out the rotation.
See a need, fill a need.
Yeah, like Iguodala, was I think he was a late addition to the Warriors roster last year, right? And he ended up not really doing much.
Right.
I know he had some injuries,
Yeah.
so maybe he would have done more, right? But again, also given his age, he didn't expect much.
Right.
Um, After that, Brandon Ingram trade rumors. I'm not into what everybody was putting out there, but none of it bothered me. So, because obviously we know the rumors about the Pelicans in the offseason. And Ingram's name at times popped up, right? I thought it was usually more so Zion,
Me
but I
too.
know Ingram also came up, a handful of times as well. Um, so obviously, the Team USA, right? They played, and they blew out Puerto Rico. And Ingram was one of those guys, who was a starter, and had an okay game, right? But, you know, uh, he had like 11 points, 5 rebounds, 3 assists. A lot was made about him looking like a little bit bigger, and which kind
It
of
was
goes
true.
back to the weight thing, we were talking
He
about.
does look
Uh,
bigger.
yeah. So what do you think of the trade rumors? And then, obviously, then after that, we can kind of mention the Team USA stuff.
I mean, like in terms of the rumors, I don't really know how to feel because it's like I think you should probably move on from Zion more so. And I know it's probably a hot take, but I think Ingram, like, I know they're both going to miss time. That's just a guarantee. They're not the most durable players. Um, but I think, Zion is probably more likely to miss more time. And I think with Ingram, like, his game is so valuable. He's a mid range assassin, he can shoot the three. Um, but his game is so smooth, and it's like I think that's a game that's probably going to last more, especially with his kind of frame. With Zion, he's prone to put on more and more weight and never figure out the health issues, and like that's just going to be a case of like what if his entire career. So that's kind of the way that I'm looking at it. Like what you're going to get with Ingram when he's out there every night when he's healthy. With Zion, you do as well. The problem is he's not going to be healthier than Brandon Ingram.
Yeah. I think that's it. I think, some people, if you have concerns, you're more concerned. Like Ingram just misses time, but it's just because he just picks up injuries, and Zion does too. But you have a little bit more questions about, how committed is he,
Right.
to improving his body? Because, like you said, Ingram has, improved his body every year. Because when he came in the league, he was very skinny.
KD 2.0, pretty much.
Yeah, exactly. And now he's put on more muscle. He's put on, more weight to add to that frame and become more solid.
Right.
Um, and then kind of to get into the larger discussion, right? The Team USA, right? For the World Cup, they were in, that exhibition game against Puerto Rico, right? Blew them out, 117-74. I think it started off kind of as a competitive game, but then,
Yes.
it just kind of went by the wayside. We know the Team USA roster. We haven't really talked about it. Obviously, again, it's not guys that are, the A-listers,
Hmm.
right? But you do have a number of solid, of good players, right? Edwards, Bridges, Ingram, Jaren Jackson Jr., Brunson, right? Reeves, Halliburton,
They're
Bobby
the
Portis,
next gen.
Tim Johnson, Boncaro, Walker Kessler, Josh Hart as well, who didn't play because he's doing that contract stuff. Um, but again, like this should be a team that should be good. I
Underrated.
I know they lost the last World Cup if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember who they lost to. But it was a similar type of roster where there weren't any like A-listers. Um,
I think it
so
was it France. I don't think it was
I
France.
think it
I
was
don't know.
France. I
Okay, I
think it
think it
might have
was.
been France.
Yeah.
I think it was France.
Yeah.
Um, for the World Cup, not the
Yes.
Olympics. The
Right.
Olympics, yeah, they went all the way, I think, but for the
Yes.
World Cup, they lost, which is different. So, I mean, I don't know, but just regardless, it is kind of interesting because again, like you're looking at these guys. Edwards, it seems like is kind of kind of taken on the this is my team kind of
Mm-hmm.
role, I think, for the team, and that's going to be interesting. And the cool thing about Team USA and the Olympics in general is that for a lot of these young guys, this is kind of like oftentimes what kind of kicks off, their big season,
Yep.
right? Where we've seen in the past a lot of guys when they're on Team USA, then they go into the next season and then they
Jalen
play
Brown.
and have like a career year, or they take like a massive leap, and that's pretty much most of this roster, right? Like there's not really any older guys on the roster. They're all they're all pretty much very young.
It's the next generation.
Exactly, like you said. So that's something that I think is going to be a very valuable for all these guys
Yes.
going into next season. Even if they don't win, which obviously we want them to win. We're rooting for them, but either way, I think it'll give all of these guys some valuable experience.
Yeah.
Along the way. Like I said, I don't know if they'll go all the way. I think they can.
I
Um,
think they will. It's an
you know,
underrated squad in my opinion. I
right.
think there's a lot of youth. There's a lot of athleticism. Definitely a lot of shooters, and there's a lot of grit and grind on this squad. And they're hungry, so I love to see it because they're so young. So
And I think you got a little bit, more size, at different positions. I mean, you have a couple of small guards, right? Like Brunson small. But after that, most of your guys are, like, Edwards is like what, 6'4" or 6'5",
mm-hmm.
but he's big.
Yep.
So, you don't really have a lot of small guys on the roster, and you do have some big. So I don't think there's quite as much of a disadvantage size wise. Like they had, I think the last time they did the World Cup, because I think last World Cup team was relatively small.
Yeah.
I think they had Lopez, if I'm not mistaken,
I
but
think you're
outside
right.
of that, they didn't really have any other like real big guys.
Yeah, and it's like I think this team can attack a lot of those foreign teams in a bunch of different ways that those foreign teams have probably never seen. So
Yeah.
I'm very curious to see how this team does, but I think they'll win it all.
Right. And then last rumor or yeah, last piece of news, to kind of throw out there. So we got not that long before we started recording, we got some leaks, for, the upcoming season, obviously, now that we're in August as we get closer, to the end of the month, you're going to start seeing, more leaks and then eventually the actual schedules will be released. So we have the official opening night schedule and we also have the Christmas games. So I'll start with the opening night. So we have Lakers Nuggets, followed by Suns Warriors. So what do you think of that opening night? I think that's a pretty good one to start with.
That's a blockbuster one.
Yeah,
I think this is good. And that's something I think all of us want to see. And it'll be cool to see everybody with fresh legs play their hearts out and show us what they got for the first, games of the season. But I like it a lot.
yeah, because you look at Lakers Nuggets, right? They had their series last year, right? Since
Hmm.
the Nuggets have won, right? We've heard some of the things that some of the players or the coaching staff has said. How hyped and excited they were. To beat the Lakers. It kind of feels like they were more excited to beat them than to beat the Heat
Yeah,
in the title, just because of how much more they talked about them.
sure.
Um, so and it's ring night, right? So obviously they get their rings, right? The Lakers watch them, once they watch them, receive their rings, and that's the team that they lost to. I again, I don't feel like it's a rivalry yet because I don't feel like there's like that heatedness,
It's brewing
that
though.
we've seen from other teams. They've met in the playoffs twice, obviously, and each time both teams have won, and went on to win the championship both years. Um, but again, I just don't, unlike some, like say like Warriors, Grizzlies, right? There's some animosity there, between some of the guys on the team.
It's not like
You know,
it's Celtics Lakers opening night.
right, exactly. But yeah, but still, it's one that makes sense. Just
People want
again,
to see it.
yeah, exactly. And then Suns Warriors, right? That makes a lot of sense as well, right? Because Durant, is on the Suns, right? And the Warriors, that's another team that should still be contending. And it's a bunch of guys playing against their former teams, right? Durant was on the Warriors, Chris Paul was on the Suns,
Yes.
so there's a lot, of drama and a lot of storylines going on there.
The
So I think
Clay and
that's
Booker rivalry
yeah,
or
Clay and Booker.
drama, beef, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, exactly. Because Clay was on his pot on Paul George's podcast, right, talking about that incident. So there's a lot there.
Yeah, throwing up
To
fours and whatever, man.
exactly. So there's a lot there to talk about. I think it's kind of intriguing because there's no Eastern Conference team that's there. Just, every year, usually um, like you usually see at least one Eastern Conference team, their opening night, right? And usually it's the first game just because it's the earlier, time zone. But this time there's none.
The East
So
is
that
weak though, and I think the
no, I
NBA
know.
knows that. I think they know what's gonna attract the most eyes, and they want to have a big opening night. And I think
Yeah,
it's a
no, I
smart
agree.
move to not include the East. I know like people want to see the East, but I think it's a smarter business move to just say
Right.
screw the East because they're weak.
Yeah, because like when you think about it, opening night, do you think more people would be intrigued by Lakers Nuggets or Heat Nuggets? Because Heat's Nuggets was the finals.
Lakers
Um,
Nuggets for sure. Because
yeah,
you have even a lot of Lakers fans. I know not you specifically, but like a lot of Lakers fans, like they were looking back at the footage and seeing Jokic and Murray hit these like circus shots, and they're like, I mean, what can we do here? Like
right.
at this moment, we knew we lost, so like now that we're better, I mean, we can take y'all out, and it's like they're
Yeah,
gonna be a higher seed anyways. So I think this is great marketing.
yeah. And then they also released the Christmas games as well. So the Christmas matchups are Bucks Knicks, Sixers Heat, Celtics Lakers, Mavs Suns, and Warriors Nuggets. So what do you think of those Christmas games?
I like all those. The Boston and Lakers, that's a great rivalry. That's like one of the longest lasting ones.
It is the
Um yeah,
lasting one.
exactly. And then you said it was Denver and Golden State.
Yeah, that's the last game.
Okay, yeah. So I mean that's pretty good, and then Bucks New York, that's interesting. I think that's a good one actually. It'll be interesting because I think the Knicks have a lot to prove. So um and
Yeah,
so do the Bucks. The Bucks also have a lot to prove as well because they did get bounced in the first round. So we
yeah.
got to check and see if they still got it like that. 76ers versus Heat. That one is probably the one that I don't really care about as much, honestly.
Really?
Yeah, I'm very curious to see the Dallas Mavericks versus Phoenix one, just because I'm so curious to see the offense.
That's a rivalry for sure, just because
Exactly.
they were in the playoffs and they were kind of jawing back and forth.
Right.
And both teams, feel like that they improved. The Suns obviously made, very significant improvements, right? Because they added Durant at the deadline and then they added Beal,
Right.
in the offseason. So that's definitely one, of note. Like you said, it is kind of interesting because, like, once you mentioned the Bucks Knicks thing in terms of the teams, both teams have a lot to prove. Because that was kind of the one initially that I felt kind of the lowest on, just because I
Really?
don't only just because, like, the Knicks, I just don't feel like, I don't
Huh.
normally have them in the same conversation. But I do think, with the addition of Brunson, and the other guys on that roster as well. And like you said, just because both teams have something to prove, it should be interesting. Because, the Knicks for a long time were always like one of the first, they were always like the first Christmas game.
Yeah.
And then
It's
because they had
Madison
the
Square Garden. Come on now.
yeah, and then they had a stretch, for like a year or so where they took them off, just because, there were other good options. But now
Yeah.
that they're a better team again, now it makes more sense, I guess, to have them in that Christmas game.
Yeah,
Because
like
like you
everybody
said,
used to wake up on Christmas and watch,
yeah,
Carmelo Anthony play in MSG. Like that was something that like, most of us got to experience. So I think it's good that they're back there and then,
right,
playing the Bucks is a great thing cuz I think the
yeah,
Bucks are going to be a strong team as well. So
yeah.
I'm very hyped for that one. But like I said, I think the 76ers in Miami one I really just don't give two craps about just because I really don't care about Embiid, quite frankly. But
If the Heat got Damian Lillard, do you think you'd be like more intrigued by that
oh
Christmas
yeah,
match? Okay,
absolutely. If the Heat do acquire Damian Lillard, that would change my mind completely. But
yeah,
as of right now, I already know what Philly is, and they're just gonna flame
yeah.
out as per
And I
usual.
think the other thing is, like, let's say if Harden gets moved, right, then I think that makes Philly probably less intriguing
Enjoyable,
potentially if they get.
exactly.
So it like you said, I think now that you kind of laid it out, I think that it makes a lot more sense that that one
Yes.
could potentially be the least intriguing game. It
Yeah.
just kind of depends because I know like the Sixers and Heat have played against each other before, um, but it doesn't really feel like like there's like a lot of ill will or malice or anything, like some of these
Yeah.
other matches. Like I said, like Memphis Golden State was the Christmas matchup last year. Now it's Warriors Nuggets, which again I don't feel like that's a negative rivalry either. Like right, like it feels like both teams have pretty
It's
high
more
level of
competitive.
respect. They played in the playoffs 2 seasons ago, right? But that was when Denver wasn't whole. So that's really like the only significant matchup we've seen out of them.
Hmm.
I think in the regular season, I think Denver has kind of bested them in the. I think they in the regular season matchup the last couple of seasons I think have done a little bit better.
Hmm.
Um, but in the playoffs, right, the Warriors have their number only because again we've only seen them one time, and that was when Denver wasn't complete.
Right.
Is it that way? Next year we'll see. Um, and then Mavs Suns we already mentioned. Celtics Lakers. I'm kind of surprised that that hadn't already been a Christmas matchup, right? Because
Right.
I think the last few years it was like I think the Lakers and Mavs played last Christmas.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah, I think 2 seasons ago. Shoot, I don't even. It wasn't like I don't remember who they played on Christmas 2 seasons ago. It was the Nets. They played the Nets, and
You're
then the
right.
year before they played Dallas. So
Yeah.
like those were kind of intriguing.
Mid.
Yeah. Well, the Nets one would have made sense, but I think Durant was hurt, so he ended
Yeah.
up not playing.
Yep.
Because it would have been Durant versus LeBron, which and they haven't played. I don't think since Durant was on the Warriors. I think it's
A
literally
long
been like
time.
4, 5 years or something like that. So hopefully we see that matchup again. But yeah, like the Lakers Celtics one, I think also makes a lot of sense. So yeah, I think all these games are going to be pretty good. Because again, you also just have more good teams in general, so it's kind of hard to mess these matchups up unless you just put two insignificant teams there.
Yeah.
Um,
If you're
but
not
outside,
if you're not, a 76ers fan or a Heat fan, I think you should probably open your presents and do all your family stuff during that game
yeah,
cuz
because that
I don't
always
know.
happens. There's always at least, there's always the one game, that's, kind of there, that
Yeah.
where like people like are kind of just like, opening presents, doing stuff with the family.
Yeah.
Because, they watch the first couple of games and then, they take a break and then you have the prime time matchups. And then like last year was weird because you had two games that came on like a half hour or so within each other. So then they
Yeah.
were kind of running sort of
Yeah,
side by.
that was really bad. That was really bad.
Yeah. Yeah, or that might have no, that was the playoffs, I think. Never mind. I think that was the
You
playoffs.
sure?
But I think because I think in
Hmm.
the playoffs it was like Denver, Minnesota, and then like there was some other team that I think was playing around the same time.
Okay.
I think for Christmas, I think what I more so meant to say was like by the time it's the last game, not as many people watch,
Oh yeah.
right? Usually the last game is the one that they kind of save for like, the graveyard slot, but
Yeah.
this time it's Warriors Nuggets.
Right.
So like that's kind of must see TV.
Absolutely.
I think. So overall I'm pretty pleased with the games they put out.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. So well, all right, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, don't forget to like, and subscribe, depending on, what you thought, right? Let us know what you thought of our take on the Dallas Mavericks in the comments, right? Whether or not you agree or disagree, with our thoughts. And again, stay tuned for the next episode. Hopefully, we got something special planned. So thanks for listening. Have a great weekend and we'll see you Monday.